In 1979, the streets of Iran delivered a moment that permanently reshaped the Middle East. Millions of people poured into the streets. The army hesitated, the security forces fractured, and the Shah of Iran, once believed untouchable, boarded a plane and fled the country. That moment did not just end a regime, it rewrote the political DNA of an entire region. For more than 4 decades, Iran's ruling clerics convinced themselves of one thing above all else: that 1979 could never happen again. Tonight, that belief is collapsing, because history may be repeating itself only in reverse. Iran's supreme leader, now 85 years old, is reportedly preparing a contingency plan to flee the country as his security forces struggle to contain a movement that refuses to die. At the same time, Iran's parliament is issuing desperate threats against U.S. military bases across the Middle East. The regime is panicking. So how did Iran reach this point? The day everything broke, it did not begin with ideology. It did not begin with slogans. It began with money. On December 28, Iran's currency collapsed. Not slowly, not gradually. It collapsed violently. Within hours, the rial entered free fall. Imports froze. Savings evaporated. Prices lost meaning. Electronic vendors were the first to go on strike, not because they were political, but because their businesses became impossible to operate. When a currency collapses, trade dies first. At the beginning, the protests were narrowly focused. People protested government mismanagement. They protested economic policy. They protested survival. But then something changed. When economic anger becomes political rage, the protests spread rapidly. From bazaars to universities, from shopkeepers to students, from isolated grievances to national outrage. And then the chants changed. No longer about prices. No longer about inflation. The streets began calling openly for the death of the dictator. That moment, the moment fear turns into defiance, is when regimes begin to die. By January 12, protests had been confirmed in more than 108 cities and towns across Iran. Every single day, more joined. This was no longer a Tehran problem. This was national synchronization, the worst possible timing. And the timing could not have been worse for Iran's leadership. Not just geopolitically, but biologically. The supreme leader is 85 years old, and reports suggest declining physical and mental health. In authoritarian systems, age is not just a number. It is a signal of mortality, a signal of weakness, a signal that loyalty may soon be optional. In 1979, Iranians did not know the Shah was dying of cancer. This time, everyone can see decline, and 3 forces are now dangerously intertwined: the physical and psychological condition of the supreme leader, the cohesion of Iran's security forces, the psychology of Iran's protesters. When leaders appear weak, soldiers hesitate. When soldiers hesitate, protesters advance. When protesters advance, regimes panic. And panic always produces mistakes. A regime that shows its fear. As protests intensified, Tehran did not respond with reform. It responded with threats. Iran's parliament warned that all U.S. military personnel and bases in the Middle East would be considered legitimate targets if Washington intervened. This was not strength. It was desperation. At the same time, repression escalated. Footage emerged, showing regime forces firing on peaceful protesters, many filming everything in real time. Then came the video that changed everything. In Siraj, regime forces detained a protester, beat him, and executed him. Captured on camera, shared instantly. The regime crossed a psychological red line. Fear stopped working. The fire spreads beyond Tehran. The reaction was immediate. Protesters attacked regime buildings. Police stations were set on fire. Street-level security bases were overrun. But while Tehran focused on controlling the capital, the rest of the country slipped away. Across 31 provinces and more than 70 cities, Iran entered open rebellion. Cities did not merely protest, they fell. Hamadan was among the first. Then came Qom, the holy city just 150 kilometers from Tehran, largely outside regime control. At that moment, the narrative shifted. The fall of Tehran was no longer a possibility. It became a matter of time. The collapse of the wall of fear. For decades, the regime relied on one weapon above all others: fear. The Revolutionary Guards, the Basij militias, the riot police, marketed as an iron fist. But within 7 days, that iron fist began to crumble. Logistics lines were cut. Communications networks failed. Command chains fractured. In cities like Shiraz and Nurabad, something unprecedented occurred. Unarmed civilians confronted armored vehicles. And won. Not with weapons, but with numbers. Police stations were seized. Uniforms were abandoned. Soldiers fled without insignia. The wall of fear did not crack. It collapsed. The chant that changes everything. Across Iran, one chant now dominates the night. Don't be afraid. We are all together. In Loristan province, civilians physically expelled Basij units from entire districts. This was not symbolic. This was territorial control. This is the moment every dictatorship fears most when orders stop being obeyed. The elite units fail. The true breaking point came when elite forces failed. Units expected to retake control within minutes failed repeatedly for days. At key intersections near Tehran, they could not advance. Failure breeds doubt. Doubt breeds defection. Reports emerged of refused orders and commanders hesitating. And when that happens, regimes don't fall slowly. They collapse suddenly. Plan B, the escape option. Behind closed doors, the regime prepared for the inevitable. Intelligence reports later leaked and confirmed, revealed a classified escape plan, a contingency to be activated if control over Tehran was lost. The plan involved evacuating the supreme leader, his family, and around 20 loyal aides. The destination had already been chosen: Moscow. This was not speculation. This was preparation. The sky tells the story. The clearest signal didn't come from the streets. It came from the sky. Over a 48-hour period, Tehran's airspace recorded activity far beyond normal diplomatic or commercial traffic. Flight tracking data confirmed Il-76 heavy transport aircraft operated by Russian and Belarusian forces landing one after another. At least 5 heavy cargo planes in just 2 days. This was not routine. This was emergency logistics. What are the planes carrying? There are 2 possibilities and both signal regime death. First possibility: weapons. Crowd control ammunition. Riot gear. Security equipment. A regime begging foreign dictators for tools to suppress its own people. Second and darker possibility: extraction. The supreme leader controls an estimated $95 billion through opaque financial networks. Those aircraft may be carrying stolen national wealth out of Iran. Either way, the message is unmistakable. The regime is dying. The security forces fracture. For decades, the IRGC was portrayed as unbreakable. That myth is now dead. Intelligence confirms widespread desertions, insubordination, and internal fragmentation. When soldiers are hungry, unpaid, and ordered to shoot neighbors, loyalty dissolves. And one message accelerated this collapse. The message that split the regime. From exile, Reza Pahlavi addressed Iran's security forces, not as a politician, but as a reminder. He told them they were protectors of a 2,600-year-old Persian civilization, not servants of a collapsing theocracy. That message cut deep. It created a fault line between national identity and ideological obedience. No regime survives an identity fracture. A leader who is already broken. The supreme leader's paranoia now extends beyond the streets. During clashes with Israel, he retreated into bunkers. Survival became obsession. Western intelligence assessments now describe a leader mentally and physically weakened, unable to control events. Plan B is no longer optional. It is inevitable. History closes the circle. The chants echoing through Iran mirror those of 1979. But history twists cruelly. The Shah fled to Egypt. This leader is fleeing to Russia, the world's largest sanctuary for failed autocrats. The global shockwave. This is not just an Iranian uprising. It is the breaking of the weakest link in an authoritarian chain stretching from Moscow to Beijing, from Caracas to Damascus. If Iran falls, the consequences are immediate. Russia's strategic nightmare. For years, Iran sustained Russia's war effort. Drones, missiles, military technology. The backbone of Russia's ability to strike Ukraine. That backbone is now breaking. Iranians know where their money went. While inflation exceeded 100%, while families struggled to eat, the regime funded Hezbollah missiles, Houthi drones, Shahed drones used by Russia against Ukraine. The streets now chant, "Neither Gaza nor Lebanon. My life for Iran." Every drone sold was a hospital lost, a school unfunded, a child hungry. The reckoning has arrived. The supply line collapses. A new Iranian government, secular or constitutional, will cut off that trade immediately. Without Iran, Russia loses its ability to sustain deep strikes. When the Shaheds fall silent, Russia's illusion of air dominance collapses. This is not just a battlefield defeat, it is the collapse of Russia's military doctrine. Moscow, graveyard of dictators. Moscow is no longer a superpower capital. It has become a refuge. A museum of failed leaders. Yanukovych is there. Assad is there. Now Iran's supreme leader may be next. A sanctuary for fugitives, not statesmen. China takes note. China values stability, not collapsing allies. Iran's fall proves Moscow cannot protect its partners. China does not bet on losing horses. The rift deepens. Putin stands alone. A leader who can only host fleeing allies cannot project power. Russia is losing influence, weapons access, and strategic depth. And this strangulation is not imposed by the West. It is driven by the will of the Iranian people. The final question. The lights going out in Tehran are flares warning Moscow. The axis of autocracy is collapsing. And history whispers one final question. If Tehran has fallen, who is next? The crisis in Iran did not erupt overnight. It built quietly, like pressure accumulating behind a fragile dam, until finally, exactly as economists warned, the system broke. Although the collapse of the rial in late December was the trigger, it was far from the only cause. Iran's economy has long been strained by decades of international sanctions, restricted access to global financial systems, and chronic mismanagement. For ordinary Iranians, these were not abstract terms. They were daily realities of soaring inflation, unemployment, and shrinking purchasing power. By late 2025, the rial had plunged to unprecedented lows against the U.S. dollar, with exchange rates approaching historic lows not seen since the tumultuous years of earlier crises. When the rial collapsed, it did not just erase savings, it wiped away confidence in the state itself. Traders in Tehran's historic Grand Bazaar, a bastion of economic and political influence historically allied with regime power, found themselves on the front lines of revolt. Once supportive of clerical rule, these merchants grew resentful as economic policies favored elites linked to the Revolutionary Guards over small businesses fighting to survive. Their defection to the protest movement was not merely symbolic, it struck directly at the economic heart of Iran's social order. Within days, protests spread from the bazaars to neighborhoods, schools, and universities across the country. Videos from social media, some transmitted via smuggled Starlink terminals despite government internet shutdowns, showed chants against clerical rule and defiant slogans like "Death to the Dictator" and "Freedom Now." The regime's attempt to cut communications, imposing another nationwide internet blackout, was an admission of its own weakness. Authorities have repeatedly used blackouts to try to suppress dissent since 2019 and again after the Masa Amini protests of 2022. But this time, the blackout came amid unprecedented violence and fragmentation within the state's security apparatus. Even the death toll from these clashes, though still difficult to verify independently because of limited reporting, points to a mounting crisis. Human rights organizations and activist networks operating inside Iran have reported hundreds of deaths, including children, while state media has released selective figures that still reflect a deadly clampdown. Across the country, the protests have grown into something that no observer predicted this early. A movement that is not simply demonstrative, but structurally disruptive. Strikes have hit essential sectors, and in some cities, security forces have been unable to contain the unrest. In multiple provincial capitals, demonstrators have confronted police, commandeered public spaces, and openly challenged the authority of clerical rule. These are not isolated skirmishes, they are localized power shifts. Nor are these actions confined to symbolic defiance. In Loristan province, protesters reportedly forced Basij militia units out of entire districts, not through negotiation but through sheer numbers and territorial control. News reports documented crowds chanting that they would not be pushed back, that they intended to hold the streets. What makes this moment particularly volatile is not just the scale of the unrest, but the public rejection of state ideology. The slogans in these demonstrations go beyond calling for economic relief. They directly confront the legitimacy of the entire system. At protests across Tehran, students and demonstrators voiced not merely frustration, but a frank wish to dismantle the political order born in 1979. This shift from economic protests to political demands is significant. In past cycles of unrest in Iran, economic grievances receded once concessions were offered or repression intensified. This time, the protests have continued even amidst harsher crackdowns and targeted violence, including mass arrests and lethal force. The regime has responded with increasingly desperate rhetoric, painting the protests as foreign plots and accusing external enemies of fomenting violence. At the same time, the government's own narrative is unraveling. State-organized rallies, featuring tens of thousands supposedly gathered in support of the regime, have been reported internationally as largely staged or attended under duress, with many participants reluctant or silent. International solidarity protests have erupted in global cities, underscoring how far Iranian public sentiment has shifted. The government's rhetoric of enemies of God, used to justify extreme punishments for protesters, marks a dramatic escalation. Iranian authorities have openly threatened death sentences for those labeled as enemies of the state, a sign of a leadership cornered and lashing out. Amid this domestic upheaval, the regime's external posture has grown more aggressive. Iranian officials have repeatedly accused the United States and Israel of interference, framing the unrest as part of a broader geopolitical struggle, an argument that plays well domestically for some segments of the population, but rings hollow for many others who see their own suffering as primarily caused by mismanagement and corruption. Iran's parliament echoed this line when it warned that U.S. bases in the Middle East would be legitimate targets in the event of perceived foreign intervention. This kind of brinkmanship reflects a state leaning on external aggression to distract from internal collapse, a classic strategy in times of domestic crisis. Yet even the military establishment has not been immune to the pressures. While official statements from Iran's army insist they will defend national interests, this comes amid signs that key segments of the security apparatus may be questioning their orders and reporting mixed loyalties. Although full-scale defections have not been verified, foreign analysts suggest that the longer the unrest continues, the greater the risk of individual units distancing themselves from Tehran's central command. Adding to Tehran's instability is a broader erosion of the regime's regional standing. Iran's military and economic resources were already stretched thin following the 2025 clashes with Israel and U.S. involvement, even if limited to political and intelligence support for protesters, has shifted perceptions both inside Iran and across the region. International reactions have varied, but at least one major power, Russia, has publicly reaffirmed its support for the Iranian government. Russia's Security Council secretary recently held talks with Iranian officials condemning foreign interference, emphasizing a shared narrative of resisting Western influence and promising continued cooperation under existing strategic agreements. This Russian statement, while intended to embolden Tehran, also reveals a deeper truth. The Iranian regime's dependence on external patrons has never been greater. Russia and Iran have cooperated closely since the start of the Ukraine war, but their relationship lacks a mutual defense clause, meaning Moscow's support is politically convenient but not legally binding in times of existential crisis. The reliance on external support, whether symbolic or material, is precisely the sign of a regime that knows its legitimacy is eroding from within. In normal times, a government does not need to broadcast the unity of foreign powers in its defense. In fragile times, it does. Meanwhile, Iranian opposition figures in exile have emerged as influential voices in shaping the narrative beyond the border. Reza Pahlavi, the son of the deposed Shah, has publicly appealed to security forces and citizens alike, urging them to stand with the people and envision a future beyond clerical rule. His messages emphasize national identity and historical continuity rather than theocratic authority, which resonates deeply in a country grappling with economic desperation and ideological exhaustion. These appeals are not merely rhetorical. They reflect a broader shift in Iranian public consciousness, away from religious governance, toward a renewed sense of cultural nationalism, a break with the ideological foundations that have underpinned the Islamic Republic for decades. When a society ceases to accept the legitimacy of its ruling ideology, the regime's structural foundations deteriorate rapidly. As casualties mount and economic hardship deepens, ordinary Iranians increasingly see their own suffering as directly tied to the political choices of their leaders. This sentiment is evident in widely circulated street slogans that juxtapose domestic needs with foreign entanglements, bitterly decrying support for proxies abroad, while bread prices remain unaffordable at home. These slogans exemplify a fundamental shift in popular priorities. In this context, the regime's fear is not simply of losing control of cities or streets. It is the fear of losing narrative control. Once people begin to believe alternatives are possible, and that their own institutions no longer protect them, the psychology of the state begins to unravel. This brings us back to the heart of the crisis: a leader in declining health, a fracturing security apparatus, and a populace whose anger has transformed from economic frustration into political defiance. These forces interact in a feedback loop that accelerates collapse. As the regime's grip loosens, the concept of Plan B, an escape to Moscow, moves from improbable speculation to a strategy grounded in geopolitical logic. If Tehran's security forces cannot suppress the uprising, and if key commanders begin to question their orders, the supreme leader's calculation shifts from suppression to survival. In that calculus, Russia represents both a sanctuary and a geopolitical statement, an acknowledgement that Tehran's traditional alliances may be its last recourse. Yet this flight would be more than a personal retreat. It would be a symbolic admission of collapse. A regime that once proclaimed its resilience against foreign pressure would be admitting exactly the opposite: that it could no longer secure its own capital, its own legitimacy, or its own future without external refuge.